Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Osavul podcast. This is where we explore the front line of the information environment, how power, narratives, and technology interact, and what it means for governments, institutions, and societies navigating uncertainty. Well, it's January 2026, and this is the first Osavul podcast of the year. And what a way to begin. Today's focus is Venezuela. Now, we are recording at a moment when events on the ground are actively unfolding, developments are fluid, conditions on the ground are changing, and the direction of travel is far from settled. That makes this an especially important time to step back from the headlines and examine the deeper structures shaping what we're seeing, what we're hearing, particularly in the information environment. And it's a real privilege to be joined today by our guest, Iria Puyosa, Senior Research Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Democracy and Tech Initiative. Iria has spent more than a decade researching how authoritarian regimes, particularly in Latin America, use technology, surveillance, and information control to suppress dissent and maintain power. She has also been a visiting professor at Brown University and previously chaired the Venezuelan Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association. Iria, welcome to the Osavul podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, let's set the scene for our listeners, and maybe we can just start by kind of mapping out Venezuela's information environment. How would you categorize it, the information space in Venezuela, during Maduro's time in power, not just in terms of censorship, but, how does information circulate on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the information space in Venezuela is characterized by the tensions produced by the repression. It's a highly repressed environment in which information flows is constrained by surveillance, monitoring, and also propaganda and more technical censorship. So those conditions had provoked the population to use different ways to access information who are maybe not exactly the same and the other more open societies, and also had reshaped the way journalism works. Most of the media in Venezuela is under the control of the government, of the regime. Even so-called private media are still under the control in terms of the editorial policy, what topics they can cover, who can they interview. That kind of aspects are all heavily controlled. So the independent media only exists online. So small digital outlets with most of the editors working from overseas, and and the reporters, the journalists on the ground having to take a lot of precautions in order to do their work. That makes for a very fragmented information space in which people don't have like those huge mainstream media everybody reads, everybody watched. There is no such a thing in Venezuela. Most people look at different places and different space depending on their particular taste or needs. And the way information tend to circulate is like a three-step flow. So digital media cover the information and they post that in social media applications like Instagram, X, more recently TikTok is becoming important. And then those links are shared by more active, information hungry citizens in their messaging apps application. So they share with their groups, with their families, friends, relatives, colleagues in WhatsApp. So most of the population is actually getting the news in WhatsApp. So from these steps, most people just get what is the snapshots of the graphic image the media put in Instagram, small audio bigs, so that the way is no, it's hard for people to access the full coverage of information, but this flow like tipping down until they reach the population. and that makes for the information being part of conversations, the
Mm.
information being part of the way people socialize with trusted contacts.
I guess, yeah, word of mouth plays an important part in that regard. So what you're saying is that there is traditional media. You have your broadcast TV, your newspapers, your radio, largely controlled and censored by the state, so state-owned, media. But there is also private media, but it's very controlled. And as you said, things are agreed on in terms of questions, who's answering questions. So in terms of your traditional media, very much controlled. And I'm assuming that a lot of external media is not accessible in Venezuela. And then therefore, as you said, the only way to get around it is through the online social channels.
Yeah, to a small clarification, there is no newspapers, printed newspapers anymore in Venezuela. They disappeared because the state had the monopoly of the paper for printing newspaper, and so they only allowed newspaper who were a part of the government to be printed, and nobody read those, so they just disappeared. There is no all the traditional newspaper, the big ones existed from the whole 20th century, are already disappeared. Some of them has had some digital presence, but very small readership. But no printed media circulate in Venezuela anymore. Regarding the aspect of the way the foreign media can be reached in Venezuela, uh, um, in case they are not particularly into Venezuelan politics. So a foreign media who doesn't cover Venezuela won't be any issues. But media who usually are covered, foreign media who we cover Venezuelan politics tend to be censored. We're talking about Argentinian Infobae, CNN in Spanish.
Mm.
Those kind of media are censored in the country, so they are blocked on the internet. So the only way for people to reach those ones are using VPNs. And actually,
VPNs.
people do that.
Mm.
There is, comparing with other neighbor countries, Venezuela had a higher level of use of the VPN because people wanted to reach news. Most of the digital outlets, the independent digital outlets from Venezuela, foreign media covering Venezuelan issues are blocked. So people you tend to have VPNs in order to reach the people. Also, some applications like X, for instance, is blocked. Signal is blocked. So for access all those resources, people need to use VPN. So it have becoming relatively more popular than in other neighbor countries in Latin America.
And when we kind of talk about producers of information, narrative, and amplifiers, um, as you said, citizens have to get around certain ways, certain restrictions, and one of them is through sharing links of news. You said WhatsApp is the kind of the most prominent communications channel. Is there a dominant platform like Facebook? You said TikTok is kind of growing when it comes to the sharing of news.
Yeah, the place for sharing news in Venezuela is X. So
Mm.
Venezuelans are heavy users of X, have been for the last 15 years or so. And most of the journalists, politicians, human rights defenders are very active in that platform. So when people want to know what is happening in terms of new, they go to X. That is the reason why X is blocked in the country. So every time a person wants to know what is happening in their country, they need to activate the VPN, go to X, in which they had their go-to journalists or the politician they followed or the human rights organizations, civil society organizations they trust, and look what those accounts are saying about the information. For more casual information, people go to Instagram. There is a boom of small sort of local digital outlets only exist in Instagram or maybe in Facebook or TikTok, but mostly in Instagram who cover
Mm,
more local issues. They are smaller. They tend to take information from digital outlets and repackage in order to get to an audience who doesn't have time for reading. So those are more visual, tend to be a little bit more like boom shell for whatever thing is happening. So that attract an audience who is not that into following the news every minute, but is still interested. So they use Instagram, and now we have this new wave of TikTokers. Some of them are very political, so connected with political issues in a more active way, and they kind of convey in a more conversational way
mm,
the news, the information of what is happening, trying to reach youth audiences who are disengaged from politics. But also we have seen recently a new phenomenon is youth, Venezuelan youth, for particular for low income background, who are going to TikTok to talk about the reality they see around them, the reality of their neighborhood, the reality of their life, and those are very popular because they're kind of very authentic. So they just go in the
mm.
street, streaming from the streets in whatever part of the cities they are, talking in a strict language, very urban. So that is a new phenomenon, and that is attracting a different kind of audiences for the news about the country.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, video content either on TikTok or Instagram attracts different audiences, younger audiences. Um, you have these explainer videos either by like an influencer, or as you said, you can package up a newsreel into a video. Someone doesn't have to read a long kind of article. I was wondering, does did the regime kind of use influencers or have kind of proxies to spread their kind of messages or narratives through these video formats, or have you seen anything like that, or maybe diaspora maybe living outside of Venezuela also commentating and using TikTok or Instagram as a platform?
Yeah, the regime had a very solid or robust information system. They have been running online operations since they started. So they were at 20 years ago. They were using blogs and
Mm,
for online forums to spread their propaganda to both Venezuelan and Latin American audience at large. They started in X back in 2009. President Chavez was the first president, the first head of state in the Western Hemisphere, being in X. He was huge for a long time. He was the most followed political figure in that platform. The Venezuelan regime have been using information operations online, coordinated information operations, using their grassroots activists, government officers, all the state apparatus, including military officers. So disinformation for hire is a booming industry in Venezuela, and the automation, so bugs, all those things have been familiar for Venezuelan audience since 2010, 2011. So it's something Venezuela has been seeing for the last 15 years. Before it was trending in Europe and United States started to talk about online manipulation, automated propaganda in 2016. Venezuela have been living with that for 5 years already. So
wow.
it's a huge, very well established apparatus. There are government agencies devoted to that. It's one of the countries, according to research for different views, who had the most stable, well-resourced information operations for manipulating online conversations using all the resources available. Venezuela was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to use artificially generated videos to target foreign audiences. The first one in the world was China. Venezuela was the second one in the world and first in the Western Hemisphere using that kind of resources. So they are always looking at new technologies, new tools in order to spread the propaganda for domestic audience, but increasingly more for foreign audiences, for Latin American audiences, for United States audiences, for Europe audiences. Venezuela have been broadcasting propaganda for United Kingdom, for Canada, for Spain. So
Wow.
for these huge operations they run in Africa, in several countries of Africa, where one of their operatives was captured there and it was facing extradition to the United States. So they deployed an operation covering several countries in Africa, trying to make impossible to do that extradition. So they have been playing online for a long time, very sophisticated operation with all the resources you can imagine.
I think that's really interesting, especially for our listeners, a lot of whom kind of work in that kind of environment themselves. So there's some key insights there. I mean, I was going to actually, ask you about when we think of hard power, soft power. From what you've just said, it sounds that the narrative control element, in order to keep and maintain and strengthen regime control, was, as you said, established, sophisticated, and central to the regime. We're speaking at a time now where, is it more correct to say it is central to the regime? It was central to the regime, but I mean that is fascinating just to hear how kind of central, sophisticated, and established it was, and also how I mean, were there? It sounds like all kind of mediums and channels were used to target different audiences, not just kind of one legacy medium, but all sorts. And as you said, probably various narratives domestically, various narratives region for the region, and then as you said, kind of internationally, and even to countries like Africa. Maybe we can actually deep dive into some examples.
Yes, it's central to the regime survival, actually. It's one of the pillars of the Chavismo consolidation in power, West information operations, and it continues to be one of the most important pillars. So they had the security pillar, the military, the coup-proofing strategies. They had the information environment, the control of the conversations via information operations, but also via surveillance and monitoring of the population. And they had the economic control of the way people can access goods in the country. So the control of the access to food, access to medicines, the ability to have business. So all of those things were kind of for me, those were the three most important pillars: economic control, the military security control, and the information environment control. That was allowed Chavismo to become so powerful and became an authoritarian regime so consolidated, like it was or it still is. I
Mm.
can say to us today, the regime still survives.
Hmm.
Is very is debilitated compared to what it was 3 months ago, but still surviving. And part of the reason why they survive is because that ability to control the population
Mm.
through censorship, surveillance, and repression.
And on that, actually, I mean, so how kind of the system, how the system kind of how leader centric is it? Or just because now Maduro's been removed, I'm sure there's other people in charge to continue the propaganda, to continue the information. So do you just see that kind of continuing, or do you think there'll be I guess pressure from the US? How do you see things kind of evolving in the short term, the medium term, and who knows, but maybe the long term too.
Yeah, the information space was disrupted. Uh, Let me start again. The information space, the information apparatus of the regime was disrupted in the first way, hours after the decapitation strikes. It took them a few hours to get back on feet, but a day after the attacks, they were already working as usual, putting to circulate threatening messages in social media and messaging apps for the domestic population, and trying to mobilize support from other audiences, other countries, particularly left-wing audiences, using the idea of imperialistic attack, while they were also trying to influence United States audiences, portraying Delcy Rodriguez, the new head of or the ruling coalition as a moderate technocratic who is going to change things in Venezuela, something no Venezuelan would ever believe, given she has been in charge of the repression apparatus for the last few years. So they have been really, really very concentrated in that, in portraying their ability to run a transition to opening markets for United States audiences while mobilizing Latin American audiences and European audiences too, particularly left wings, for with the idea of an attack of sovereignty and U.S.
Mm,
imperialism. So they play in different conversations with different angles, different narratives, and they are working as usual in
mm.
that regards.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, around the topic of sovereignty, especially, I was going to kind of just continue on that. So, how kind of defensive or offensive are these narratives? You said, they're trying to influence different, the U.S. citizens. Is it just to influence? Is it to just try get their kind of narrative out there, or is it more to almost disrupt kind of other narratives? Or as you say, maybe it's just to to spin the story differently. I kind of yeah. So sovereignty would be key. I guess resources, trade, and various other kind of hot topics would be I guess these key pillars when it comes to the information operations. But yeah, how kind of offensive or defensive would you say it is?
I think there is pretty offensive.
Mm,
They are in attack. That's usually the way they do. They are better attacking than defending, as we can all learn very clearly. They are really, really good attacking, not so good defending.
mhm,
They have been putting all these efforts in kind of laundering the regime image for different audiences with different arguments. So for audiences here in the United States, they try to lure this audience that they are good business partners. They are ready to do business with U.S. Corporations. While for our audience in Europe, they use the international law card and this is an attack on sovereignty. For Latin America, they use the argument of this is U.S. imperialism. So they use different audience depending on what they think will resonate better in their targets, and they are really good identifying those particular points in which they can exploit. While for Venezuelans, since Venezuelans no longer buy their propaganda because they know it too well, so they use fear. They use threats. They
mm,
say so. So you keep quiet, stay in your home, don't say anything because if you go out, you will be jailed. So
right.
those are the targeted messages. So they put those messages to circulate, particularly using messaging apps in way to prevent to force people to stay quiet.
So it sounds like, there's a level of understanding between the public of like what is state propaganda and what isn't. There's a level of media literacy out there.
Yeah, people have already learned. So having 20 years dealing with
Mm,
that at the beginning, when Chavismo was emerging and growing, there was a lot of buying in for the population about this is going to be well redistribution. Those people are trying to make everyone better, equality, although typical communist propaganda. But
mm,
after 20 years, every Venezuela is poor, and all kind of indicators, healthcare, education, housing, property, salaries, everything you can name it is far worse than it was 30 years ago. So people
mm.
just understand they can't say anything, but we are all worse as a society than we were before when we had democracy. So people, of course, stop believing their propaganda and now
Hmm.
know how they work.
And how do you what would you say would you expect to see in terms of changes? If there is going to be a genuine transition, do you how do you think that would kind of impact the information environment, and what changes do you expect seeing?
Well, actually, in the case Venezuela start moving to our transition, first things I expect to see as a signal or this is really a transition is the escarcelation, the liberation of the political prisoners. As you know, Venezuela is the country in the Western Hemisphere and one of the countries in the world who had more political prisoners. It's well over 1,000 political prisoners as we speak now. And the liberation of political prisoners should be the first signal of this is going to be a transition to democracy. But
Mm,
probably the second sign we will see, and I will interpret as a move toward transition to democracy, is to start to see opening on the information environment, start to see the television in the country covering the real information what happenings in the country, even in case they editorialize in a mild way, but just having information about what's happening in the country, it would be a sign of this is an opening toward democracy. Uh,
mm.
the stopping the blocking of the internet, the digital environment will be an important signal of moving toward transition to democracy. We haven't seen any of these things happening yet, but that will. When that happens, we can say the transition process is starting. Before that happens, is the regime is still in place with all their apparatus.
Something to keep an eye out for, indeed. And if we just look at the situation that's happening now, I mean, the events on the ground are changing very quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. Have you noticed any particular disinformation stories, propaganda, kind of, or conspiracy theories that are worth highlighting and kind of fact checking? Anything in particular around, what's been happening since, Maduro's extradition?
Well, we see. I won't say we have seen a conspiracy theory, but we can see the kind of laundering of information. For instance, United States reopening their embassy in Caracas. It was portrayed by the state media as an operation Venezuelan regime is doing in order to be able to offer more support to Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores while they are in trial, instead of what everybody else interpret the empire
Mm.
is bad. So they
I
just
mean,
they
yeah.
just change the meaning of the events in a way is kind of shocking. So they allow it the reopening of the embassy in order to have access to provide more services to their former leader now in jail.
And for our listeners, for the analysts out there, what would you say is the most important thing that they should be paying attention to right now?
Well, this aspect I mentioned about the real signals of transition, like the release of political prisoners and the stepping down from the information controls, I think those things are important to watch. But also, you should be watching what is happening with the economic situation of the country,
Mm,
how the whether or not United States corporations are willing to go back to Venezuela to do business there. But also, it's important for somebody who is new to the Venezuelan analysis, to the analysis of the information environment in Venezuela, to understand the way these systems is intertwined with the repression apparatus, how that is connected with the surveillance apparatus, how those things work together in order to understand some of the campaigns they do. For instance, it was a very, very important use of the social media for terrorizing people who would be shocking for audience from other countries. So the videos on Instagram of the capture videos posted by state security agencies when they capture people on the street or in their houses, and they terrorize them. They use like a terror movie. So things like Chucky. You remember Chucky? So they
yeah.
use the Chucky character as a mask when they are capturing people, when they are entering people's houses to jail them arbitrarily. So that kind of
Mm,
use of social media by authorities is very unusual. It's typical of the Venezuelan repression apparatus because
mm,
their main aim is terrorize people.
Yeah.
So those are things you should be looking at. You also should be looking at the way they portray their weaknesses and their strengths, how they frame what they are doing in terms of regime, a stable, consolidated regime. So those aspects you should be looking at to try to read what is the real position and compare with the different message they are putting for different audiences. So you can triangulate the different aspects of the way they are looking at the situation.
And you kind of did touch on that now, but whilst there's a US presence, I can imagine there being quite a lot of efforts in the information environment to maybe discourage the public from showing their support or to try suppress, to try control. You did mention with the Chucky masks, but I'm sure that information operations, social media will continue to play a key role with that.
Well, there's actually an official decree and a executive order, as they call here in the United States, declaring an emergency state. Part of that emergency state is restriction to the ability of people to transit the country, and there have been the deployment of checkpoints in different parts of the city. In those checkpoints, people are asked for their phone, and their phone is revised by the police officers or paramilitary individuals to look for any news related to the United States attack, in case the person had sort of news or comment a conversation in WhatsApp kind of celebrating the capture of Nicolás Maduro. They can go to jail for that. They were recently couple of days ago, like 20 teenagers, kids from 12 to 16 years old, were jailed because they were playing in the streets, and the police say they were celebrating the capture of Maduro. So those teenagers were sent to jail. Apparently, according to their family, they were just playing in the streets like youth in low-income neighborhood used to do normally.
Sure. And Iria, before we kind of wrap up, any closing remarks or any key points we maybe haven't covered so far that you'd like to cover?
Well, it's hard to do a forecast of what is going to happen in the future of Venezuela. So it's difficult for me to say what should be expecting, but maybe important to say that Venezuelans are going to be more vocal about the demands for democratization as the day goes. Has the regime start to look a little bit weaker in there because they had too many fronts open at the moment, expecting to see more a revival, reemergence of uh, uh, citizen organization, and we actually have seen small groups concentrating close to the torture centers, asking for the torture centers to be closed down and the political prisoners to be released. So I expect to be seeing more than that. So expect student movements to become vocal again and mobilized in the street against. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens too. And thank you, Iria, so much for joining us on the Osavul podcast. Some really fascinating insights that you shared about the systems, the structures, and what's really happening. We follow everything on the news, but we don't really understand the full situation, and it just seems like a highly complex and a rapidly evolving situation. So we will make sure to keep in touch and to stay informed.
Perfect. Thank you.
And just to our listeners, thanks again for tuning in to the Osavul podcast. It's a new year, and there's certainly a lot to discuss when it comes to geopolitics and the information environment. So stay tuned. We'll have more episodes on the Osavul podcast as the year progresses. So thanks for listening, and we look forward to the next conversation. Bye for now.